Maybe the event will start now. Good morning. Welcome to the Center for American Progress, both people here in the room as well as people online. My name is Alan Yu, and I'm the Senior Vice President for National Security and International Policy here at CAP. Before we get into today's events, I wanted to take a moment to extend condolences to all affected by the conflict that began in Israel this weekend, Israeli and Palestinian civilians alike, and Americans as well. Hamas's acts of terror on innocent civilians are deplorable, and they must be widely and forcefully condemned, and CAP does. As a global community, it's imperative that we come together to bring an end to this violence, and address the underlying cycles of abuse and oppression in the region. All of us at CAP continue to hope for and work towards a swift resolution. As for today's events, I'm looking forward to today's program because it's clear we're at a pivot point for the next generation of trade policy. As the world confronts the effects of climate change, as the Biden administration prioritizes workers' rights, and as geopolitical dynamics shift, it's crucial that we chart an intentional path forward on trade. Who better to discuss that path forward than Ambassador Katherine Tai, the 19th United States Trade Representative. She's the principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on U.S. trade policy in the President's cabinet. Ambassador Tai has spent most of her career in public service, focusing on international economic diplomacy, monitoring, and enforcement. And prior to her role as U.S. Trade Representative, she served as Chief Trade Counsel and Trade Subcommittee Staff Director on the House Ways and Means Committee, where she helped shape U.S. trade law, negotiation strategies, and both bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, including the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And we at CAP are thrilled to welcome her back for her second visit to CAP. Well, kinda. In April 2021, Ambassador Tai delivered the keynote at a CAP virtual event on making U.S. trade policy greener. Today, we're delighted to finally welcome her to the CAP stage in person. Ambassador Tai will deliver keynote remarks, and then she'll sit down with CAP President and CEO Patrick Gaspard for a conversation followed by some audience Q&A. Ambassador Tai, welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Alan, for that very kind introduction. Before I get started, I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the horrific terrorist attacks that happened in Israel over the weekend. As President Biden said on Saturday, and I quote, "In this moment of tragedy, I want to say that the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back. This is also a terrible tragedy on a human level. It's hurting innocent people, seeing the lives that have been broken by this, the families torn apart. It is heartbreaking," end quote. My thoughts are also with all those who have been impacted by this violence. To be here today, though, I do want to say that, Alan, it is wonderful to be here with all of you in person to share how we are delivering through our trade agenda on President Biden's vision to build our economy from the middle out and the bottom up. Patrick, thank you so much for having me today. You have long been a catalyst for change. You dedicated your career to lifting up workers and to raising the quality of life of communities around the world, including as U.S. Ambassador to South Africa. You transformed hope into tangible progress for so many people, and it is especially meaningful to share the stage with you. Change is what our administration is about. Change for the better, for our workers, for more communities across the country, and for our planet. We are beyond just talking. In our third year, we are transforming trade and delivering results. When President Biden asked me to serve as his trade representative, he tasked me with putting workers at the center of our trade initiatives. And that is because the president's vision is an economy where, as he puts it, everyone is cut in on the deal. As the president said at the United Nations last month, the United States has a duty to join together with partners who share a common vision of the future of the world, where our children do not go hungry, where workers are empowered and our environment is protected, where entrepreneurs and innovators everywhere can access opportunity everywhere. Our administration is using trade to make this future a reality. In a world of uncertainties and growing economic insecurity, the status quo we know is not good enough, and we are doing something about it. At its core, our worker-centered trade policy is about people. The economy is more than numbers. It is people. So our economic policy must work for our people. Our work to implement and enforce the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement exemplifies this belief. Trade tools are not trophies to be admired on shelves. They are living arrangements between dynamic economies and are meant to be used and put to the test. And that is exactly what we are doing. We are actively working with Mexico to advance labor cases through the USMCA's rapid response mechanism to make sure that this agreement helps drive a race to the top. About 90% of the cases have been in the auto sector, and we are seeing real change and success for workers and independent unions in Mexico. New collective bargaining agreements, major salary increases, safer working conditions. This is having a real impact on working people's lives, not only in Mexico, but also here at home, because elevating labor standards in Mexico empowers U.S. workers by reducing unfair incentives to ship jobs overseas. In our most recent actions, we are pushing further forward into the procedures laid out in this mechanism, as you saw in our request for a panel in the San Martin mine case. We are committed to using every enforcement tool at our disposal to safeguard workers' rights and across the board. In May, I was honored to invite UAW President Shawn Fain and AFL-CIO Secretary-Treasurer Frederick Redmond to present and speak with my APEC trade minister colleagues at a first ever labor discussion forum at the APEC Trade Ministerial that we hosted in Detroit. In order to understand why we are placing the interests and needs of our workers at the center of our trade policies, and in order to work with us to develop a more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient economy in the Asia-Pacific region, it is critical for our partners to meet and hear directly from the leaders of our worker organizations, not just our company CEOs. During our APEC host year, we are also seizing the opportunity to demonstrate the power of inclusion as a means to promote economic opportunity and competition. This means lifting up women entrepreneurs and workers, helping small businesses grow, and unlocking economic opportunities for underrepresented parts of our populations. And we are walking our talk. In San Francisco in November, APEC trade ministers will hear from and engage with indigenous leaders from around the Asia Pacific so that their voices can help shape our work. We are focused on empowering more workers and more communities to thrive in the new global economy. And that means trading smarter, more strategically, in pursuit of better outcomes and a more inclusive prosperity across our societies. Our work with India is a good example. Since June, we have been able to achieve targeted market opportunity breakthroughs for American farmers and producers, including for turkey, blueberries, pecans, and pork exports to India. This happened outside the usual trade agreement context that some see as the only kind of trade success that counts. But let me assure you, our farmers and producers know that these wins count. And this is also why our major trade initiative in Asia, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, is not a traditional trade deal. It is our vision for how countries can collaborate to deliver real opportunities for our people and collectively respond to the challenges that we are facing today without pitting our middle classes against each other. We need a different approach, not trickle-down economics in trade form, not maximum tariff liberalization that contributed to the hollowing out of our industrial heartland. an approach that can lift all boats, one where economies collaborate on common sense rules to prioritize resilience and help smaller businesses compete and thrive without undercutting workers. Let me give you some real-world examples. Many small businesses face burdensome paper-based customs procedures across the region that stymie exports and impose significant costs. So we are working with IPEF partners to fix and improve that, including through new automation and digital procedures that create uniformity and fairness and reduce costs. Whether it's the turkey farmers I met in North Carolina 2 weeks ago, or the artisans hand-making craft chocolates in Vietnam, this will be a tangible benefit that will help their businesses and their livelihoods. Another example is on transparency. When regulatory changes happen without sufficient notice and chance for input, it creates uncertainty that makes it hard for companies to do business, especially the smaller ones, and for stakeholders to prepare and adapt. And that is why we are working in the IPEF trade pillar to improve public access to information about regulatory actions and make sure stakeholders can review and comment on rules that affect them. A third example is sustainable agriculture. This can play a big part in our cooperative efforts to address the climate crisis. We are working on rules to enable policy approaches that are grounded in science, evidence, and transparency so that our farmers, ranchers, and producers can continue to lead in advancing climate-smart approaches to agricultural production. And I'm glad to be teaming up with Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, who has made the largest investment in climate-smart agricultural research in U.S. history. And our work on streamlining customs procedures and on transparency will especially be beneficial for smaller farmers who do not have the same capacity as big agribusinesses to navigate complex rules. We have been driving an ambitious schedule, negotiating for the IPEF, and we have made significant progress just in the span of 1 year. This is a sign that our partners also recognize the need to do things differently for their own resilience. We are currently also hard at work with the European Union to fundamentally shift the paradigm for trade and production in steel and aluminum from a race to the bottom to a race to the top. That means working together to create incentives for addressing non-market excess capacity in those sectors and combating the climate crisis. With no shortage of ambition, we are aiming to tackle both at the same time with a deal that we are calling the Global Arrangement on Steel and Aluminum. We owe it to our workers and industries on both sides of the Atlantic to curb the overflow of these products enabled by countries using unfair policies and practices. This will help defend workers and their communities from the harmful effects they've suffered for too long. And we want to incentivize cleaner production and trade in steel and aluminum to provide a pathway toward a more sustainable industrial future. In a nutshell, our goal is to incentivize fair competition and a race to the top for our planet. We've been working very hard on this over the last 2 years, and we are making progress, and I fully expect to be able to share that progress in the next weeks. I also want to emphasize the global nature of this endeavor, and not just because the word is in the name. Our vision is for this tool to eventually be expanded to include other like-minded partners and perhaps other sectors, because as it turns out, we are all in this together. When it comes to crafting a fair and more equitable future for our people through trade policy, we must work together with countries in every region and stay united in our cause. Our partnership with Africa is also an important part of this vision. I will be heading to Johannesburg at the end of this month with many colleagues from this administration, Congress, labor, and civil society, and the private sector to co-host the 20th United States Sub-Saharan Africa Trade and Economic Cooperation Forum with South African Minister of Trade, Industry, and Competition, and my friend Ibrahim Patel. The annual forum was a key part of the African Growth and Opportunity Act when it was signed, and AGOA remains an important program for the United States to support Africa's ongoing regional economic integration and to empower more people to reap the benefits of economic growth. AGOA has served as a core tool to help utilize Africa's incredible potential to increase investment and to create new jobs across the continent. AGOA's congressional authorization expires in 2 years. We are committed to working closely with Congress on a forward vision for AGOA that reflects changes on the continent and opportunities for improvements. In terms of improvements, consider that utilization rates remain low. So let's discuss what changes might improve and raise those rates, particularly among the smaller and less developed countries in Africa. And in terms of changes on the continent, consider that since AGOA was renewed in 2015, the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA, has come into being. So our program to support African economic development should reflect this important milestone. We recognize that a successful new trade paradigm must reimagine trade and development as a partnership and a more equitable two-way street. When I traveled to Nairobi in July to discuss the U.S.-Kenya Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership, among other things, I was reminded again how Africa's vibrancy and potential are extraordinary and undeniable. The continent's success is inextricably linked to ours, and we need to row together for our people, for our future. Last time my staff and I counted, we had logged more than 200,000 miles crisscrossing the globe, which now brings me back to our own hemisphere and the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. It's not just USTR working day and night to rewrite our new story on trade. The entire administration is so busy that we are pulling double duty. While I'm in Johannesburg for the AGOA Forum, President Biden will be hosting America's Partnership leaders in Washington to continue discussions on our shared prosperity. The president believes trade can be a force for good, and so do I. The decisions that we make today will directly affect the world future generations will shape and lead. So it is on us, those of us doing this work now, to do trade in a new and better way, to provide economic security for the American people, to build a brighter tomorrow for our collective resilience and prosperity, and to craft meaningful, durable change one step at a time. It is an honor to serve in this administration, one that and work for a president that fully embraces this vision and this challenge. And I look forward to talking about all of these issues and more with Patrick shortly. Thank you.
$200,000 miles. That's impressive.
Please don't consider the carbon footprint of.
I'm not. I'm just really pleased that your 200,000 miles has managed to get you back to the CAP stage twice. So we're proud to be a small part of that extraordinary journey. I was taking furious notes as you spoke, Ambassador. There's so much to cover, from labor rights to supply chains to clean energy. Really want to thank you for those invigorating and illuminating remarks. But I'm going to say I'm incredibly envious now that I know that sometime in the next few weeks, you're going to be heading back to that South African summer in Joburg. I wish I could join you all. But we're going to touch a bit on that later in the conversation when we go, I think, a little bit more in depth on what AGOA renewal means on both sides of the Atlantic. But I want to start, if I can, with the 30,000-foot elevation of what this new industrial policy means. We know that this administration across the board, from the president, all of the cabinet agencies have worked furiously to actualize this historic commitment to renewed, surprising industrial policy in the country that has reinvigorated industries across the board and has made a significant contribution to the states that you mentioned before that have been hollowed out. Can you kind of ground us in what that means for ensuing 21st century trade policy through your vision? We appreciate some of the things that we hear you say about building the middle out, moving past the status quo. But what does that mean practically as you think about America's role in the world of trade in these next decades?
That's a great question and a really important foundation and foundational place to start from. I think one of the really important aspects of what we're doing now is that we're doing so much, but nothing in what we're doing is really a traditional approach. And I think that it's really important to recognize this, because I think that it gets lost in the conversation sometimes that if it's not the thing that you've been doing over and over again, then, what could you possibly be doing? But if you just look at the world around us, from the economy to geopolitics to supply chains and sort of the clockwork of, how we are interconnected to each other across all areas, you just see a significant amount of change that's happening. And so from our perspective, in order to be responsible and responsive, the trade policies that we pursue have to reflect the changes. And moreover, it's not just change for change's sake, but that we're pursuing a really positive, affirmative vision for the kind of economy that we want to have, for the kind of economy that we want to lead in partnering with the rest of the world, to push towards a version of America in the world, and the rest of the world that is bright, where you can see a long future ahead of you, and that means a sustainable path, and one where we feel like opportunities are rife and that they're not shallow. So bringing that back to where we are now, one is the recognition that there's change all around us. We have to respond. We have to be positive about where we're driving towards. The other is to recognize that we're not writing on a blank slate. That the current economy that we have reflects decades of trade policies, but also economic policies that have led us to a certain set of outcomes. So if you look at overall US GDP, we are still the largest economy in the world. We are extremely vibrant, but you also have to recognize that sectorally, there's a significant unevenness. And while parts of our economy are incredibly strong, powerful, growing rapidly, that other parts of our economy are eroded from maybe where we have been in the past, but also where we would like to be. And certainly in terms of our industrial capacity, we do still make things here, don't get me wrong. But I think that we have a recognition that unless we start to do things differently, we will continue to see this trend of erosion in areas that we cannot afford to have erosion. And I think that goes to this focus on a reinvigoration of the American economy, of American manufacturing, this embrace of what I will call a very unique type of American industrial policy. And I'm really glad you have asked me about this, because I think that in the trade community for a very long time, industrial policy was something that, you used to accuse people of doing a bad thing. Industrial policy was a bad thing. And I think that, the traditional way we have talked about and thought about industrial policy is it's a thing that you did for yourself, to enrich yourself, to empower yourself at the expense of others. I think that the major change that we are introducing into this conversation is, yes, there are things that we need to do for ourselves. There's a correction that we have to accomplish through reshoring, for instance, bringing back online a critical level of manufacturing activity, for example. But at the same time, we are interconnected with the rest of the world. That this is, in a way, part of what we are aiming for, but we want to be interconnected in a way that is positive. And so from a trade policy perspective, the question is, can you pursue industrial policy in a way where you can do it in a complementary fashion with other economies? So whether that's through supply chains, through coordinating defenses against unfair policies, we are looking for better ways of acknowledging the challenges that we have encountered to ensure that we can safeguard the freedoms that we so value in our economic market-based situation.
You're absolutely right, Ambassador, that of course, for so long in our politics, industrial policy has been used as a kind of pejorative as we move from the industrial economy to the service economy to now the information economy. But some of what you just said about the supply chain begs another question for me about what we've learned in the trade space as a consequence of the crisis of the global pandemic and what that did to our economies of trade.
Yes. So this is another important touch point for us that is informing the way we're doing trade, where we feel we have new pathways and areas where we're actively inviting our partners to help innovate with us. Our trade policies incentivized the pursuit of maximum cost efficiency, right? If you liberalize, the more trade that you can have, the better off we all will be, the more peace there will be in the world, and the less things will cost, right? So that, in a way, we see has led to what we call in shorthand the race to the bottom. The pursuit of lowest cost labor, lowest cost compliance, and this kind of arbitrage. The result is we had a period of time of great efficiency, right? Very low costs, but the other cost not accounted for was the risk of breakage and fragility. And I think that the pandemic is such an important experience because it's something that we all experienced. And it's a situation where we saw that the pursuit of lowest cost has allowed for significant concentration of production and supply in certain places in the world. And that when those places are also the ones in a pandemic that lock down first, that we're all stuck with public health consequences, national security consequences across the board, economic consequences. So what we're trying to do on supply chains is really think through from USTR's perspective, how can we harness the power of the tools that we have to incentivize firms to make decisions where they're not just solving for efficiency, they are also solving for resilience. And that is, I think, one of the most important issues that we've been focused on across the administration, but certainly one at USTR, and one where we are looking for partnership from the US Congress and also from our trading partners to come up with more resilient arrangements to allow us to withstand the shocks that we know are going to come, even if we can't predict what they're going to look like.
Thank you, ambassadors. So as you expound on the resistance to the, oops, do we have a mic problem? That was a smooth handoff. As you expound on the resistance to the race to the bottom, I can't help but note that you mentioned my friend Sean Fain and the UAW twice in your remarks. And they, of course, are in the midst of a critical make or break strike right now against the big three automakers. And I just wonder, in the context of industrial policy, and we all, of course, appreciate that the UAW was really critical for the growth and the resilience of the middle class in America. How you're thinking about broadly at a time when workers are increasingly using this notion of collective power and collective expression to raise benefits and wages, not just in the auto industry, how you're thinking about U.S. trade policy in terms of the president's goals to strengthen the platform for workers. And then the part two of that question, because you've noted resilience and transitions, I wonder, given the specificity of the concerns of the UAW around the climate transition in their industry, how that plays into trade negotiations as well.
This is a great question. So, how are we incorporating the viewpoints of workers and placing their interests at the center of our trade policies and our approach? There are a number of ways. One is that, we expand out the table for trade policy discussions and considerations, and we make sure that our friends from labor are there, along with our friends from business who have been there for decades. You learn a lot by expanding that table. And I think that the participants at the table learn a lot from each other as well. In our trade negotiations, for instance, the labor provisions and environmental provisions have gone hand in hand together in our trade policy practice for 2 decades now. Actually, even further, if you go all the way back to the NAFTA, and you see the push for incorporating those disciplines into the trade agreements. So the labor provisions themselves are incredibly important. But the other significant, observation that I would make and learning that I have is that workers' interests in our trade work isn't just limited to the labor provisions. So to your example of this summer of labor and worker empowerment, first of all, just quote the president to say, the middle class built America, and it's unions that built the middle class. I'll also note the jobs numbers that came out last Friday, which were incredibly strong. And once again, surprising everybody, even in terms of estimates, think that the official estimates were for job growth, but at a smaller scale than we actually saw. So what is going on here? Nowhere
near the 336,000 jobs.
That's right. That's right. So what's going on in our own economy is a bit unpredictable. And, I think that that's unnerving, but there are actually a lot of good things that are happening in our economy. And it's also showing the strength of the labor market. So at this point in particular, I guess, what I would just say is whether it's the UAW, and we are following the news and progress there very, very closely, or the Hollywood strike. One thing that you should see as a through line between these two is the centrality of the technology development in both of these dynamics. And so I would just highlight also in all the different provisions of what we do on trade and how we think about workers' equities, that digital piece in particular, the piece that reflects the technological advancements and its interplay with our economy, is also one where workers' interests are deeply embedded, and one where we really need to push ourselves to think more broadly, more expansively, make sure that we get this right. And that we bring a significant amount of wisdom to how we approach those issues.
I'm gonna circle back to my part 2 of that question on climate and things like the EV transition when I raised China a little later in this conversation. But I noted in your remarks that you mentioned the pioneering work that you and your colleagues are engaged in India, which is outside of a traditional trade agreement, and that absolutely centers resilience in the middle class on both sides of the trade table. I wonder if you can just give us a little bit more detail on how that deal is structured, whether we may see it replicated elsewhere. And I'll also note that this is done by suspending some WTO disputes. And I wonder if you might be able to explain that as well.
I'd be delighted to. So I think in the case of India, we started this administration knowing that this is an important economic relationship where we've been really stymied over years across administrations in terms of trying to harness all the ways in which we feel like we have alignment into some kind of economic collaboration. And it's been very, very hard. What was interesting for me is, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, and hopefully he also remembers that we had this conversation, which I think he does. My first conversation with the Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, from India was over Zoom, early days in our administration. And I thought I'd just ask him, because I was curious. And here I had the Indian Commerce Minister on the line, why it was that India chose to withdraw from the RCEP after going through all those rounds of negotiations, and sort of right at the kind of do or die moment, they decided, actually, no, we're going to take a pass on this. And as he does, he gave me a very direct answer, which was, well, we did the economic calculations and we saw that it was not going to be a good deal for us, that, you know, it would exacerbate the trade deficit that they had with the other big economy in the region, being China, and that they didn't see a lot of upside. And I thought, well, you know, that's the kind of analytical approach. If I can understand what India is trying to accomplish, and I think you're absolutely right, with now the largest population in the world, it is absolutely at the top of India's mind in terms of its trade policies and economic policies. How do we grow our middle class, and how do we keep this engine growing? And from my perspective, then, you know, look at the trade tools that we have. We have brought cases against India, and they have brought cases against us. You know, the 7 disputes that we just buried the hatchet on are old disputes. And, you know, where is the upside? Where can we find opportunity? And it really required us to think outside the box. So you're right. I think in terms of bearing the hatchet on these disputes, we also were able to open up some market opportunities. I think we will continue to push ourselves also because of this moment of alignment between New Delhi and Washington. It is incumbent on us to figure out how we can make opportunities work for both of us. And it's actually extremely exciting, the progress that we've made in 2.5 years. It
seems so radical in Washington, D.C. to be talking about compromise, concession, and diplomacy. So congratulations on that progress. There are so many questions that I have, but since you yourself raised China in the context of India strategic thinking about their relationship with the U.S. and the West, let's go to China. I'm not going to even ask a specific question. I'm going to keep it just really broad to say, so what on earth is exactly our trade policy with China now in this delicate moment that we find ourselves in? And I hope that in your response, Ambassador, you'll bring in notions of what it means to cooperate on climate.
Great. So since you let me have the very, very broad question, I think that I will reciprocate by saying it is really important for us through trade to continue to pursue a policy of correction and rebalancing in terms of our relationship with China on trade. At the same time, it is really incumbent on us to approach that project with rationality and sobriety. And so I think you will see across the board from our administration a very sober rhetoric that attaches to how we talk about China. That is intentional. And I think at the same time, right, we recognize that China is second largest economy in the world. Can't ignore it. You can't pretend that it's not there. And also, we can't divorce China economically. So how do we also try to make this relationship work? And I think that on climate, that should be an area where our interests are aligned in terms of we all have next generations who need to and who deserve a bright future and a long future ahead of them. And I think that that is an area that I'm hopeful that we'll be able to make progress on with China and frankly, with the rest of the world as well.
The last time that we were fortunate enough to have you in this space, Ambassador, you did say very pointedly that you thought that we had to use trade policy in order to orient us all towards greener outcomes in the world. So how does a worker-centered trade policy do that? Is it possible to harmonize the two? I wonder if maybe the example of Mexico might be lifted up in the context here with auto, et cetera.
Great. So there are these twin mandates that we have. One is to place workers at the center of our trade policies. I'll say in terms of climate, that is also for our workers and our people, right? There are many different angles on this. Yes, I think that addressing the climate crisis is important for its own sake. But also, I think it is really important for the sake of our people and their futures. And more specifically, it is really important for our workers and our workforce as we are evolving our technologies and our industries to be able to ensure that there are still middle-class jobs for workers in these new industries is a critical piece of sustainability. It's different kind of, not green sustainability, but policy sustainability. And so I think that what we are seeing playing out in the auto worker conversations around their contracts really highlights this particular intersection of two policy necessities. In terms of our work with Mexico on the USMCA and the rapid response mechanism, I think that it is not an accident that 90% of those cases have been in the auto sector. I think that that is a sector that has been completely transformed by this trilateral economic relationship across North America, and is an area where I think the pressures of the economic integration coupled with what had been very long-standing suppression of worker rights in Mexico, and also I would say, lower levels of compliance and standards with respect to environment have led to an erosion of standards for ourselves. And so the work that we are doing in the USMCA to raise standards in Mexico is also about raising standards for us and ensuring that the huge changes that are happening in this industry, happen in a way that is aligned with a positive outcome as much as possible.
Ambassador, I always admire the enthusiasm that you have to dive into the most complex issues. So we have just a few minutes before we have to open things up to the reporters who are here and the rest of our audience. But speaking of complex issues, I'd be remiss in not raising the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which I'm passionate about. I had the privilege of working on the renegotiation of the 2014 agreement that gave an unprecedented 10-year on-ramp to the 46, I believe, African nations that were benefiting from AGOA. It's up for renewal at the end of next year. Congress has the pen on this. You mentioned the changes that have occurred on the African continent in the way of liberalized trade amongst African nations. But even with that, we know that we're at a moment where Africa, with its population tipping over 1 billion, has the same, if not slightly smaller, GDP of all of France, which only has 66 million people in it. There is radical underutilization of AGOA on the continent, and I wonder what changes you'd like to see to AGOA in this moment of renewal that could expand utilization and increase opportunity on both sides of the Atlantic. I want those South African avocados to come here.
I've not had a South African avocado, so yes, okay, all right, I'll look forward to it. This is a really wonderful question. We do have just about 2 years left in this authorization of AGOA, and I'm glad that you were very careful to state the fact that Congress has the pen, because just as when we're nominated for positions, you always say if confirmed, right? So what I want to do is be very, very respectful of the fact that it is Congress's job whether to reauthorize and when to reauthorize, and of course. As an AGOA renewal process comes up in this period of time, we are committed to fully supporting and partnering with Congress to ensure that there is as robust and successful a process as we can put together. To your point about low rates of utilization, I mean, I think that, there's one aspect of AGOA that remains very powerful, which is it is our foundational program and our expression of economic support for the African continent, the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. But I think it is really important, as usual, to test the success and the effectiveness of our program. And there are certainly beneficiaries of AGOA who have utilized the program to great effect. But at the same time, we see very low utilization rates. So I think right there is an obvious area of improvement. I won't get into the specifics in terms of how, but I think that it is absolutely the right question, which is how can we improve utilization rates? How can we make this an even more successful program for supporting our partners in Africa? The AFCFTA, which has come into being, I think that, what's really important to recognize in that endeavor is Africa's own effort to integrate itself with itself. And I think one of the most incredible examples that was shared with me last year at the African Leaders Summit, colleagues from Africa told me, oftentimes to fly from one country in Africa to another, that's not even that far away because of the commercial flight patterns. It is easier to fly out of Africa into Europe and then fly back in. And there are actually not that many direct connecting flights inside of Africa itself. And I think then, you realize that in terms of our support for development in Africa, which I am so convinced is critical to strong and vibrant future for all of us in the world, we have to take into account this incredibly important initiative for the countries in Africa and think about how AGOA can reflect and support that integrative effort. Last point I'll make on AGOA is for those countries that have actually done quite well in terms of the economic development curve that are rising up into middle income status, there is a graduation process out of AGOA. There's kind of a cliff that, your success basically leads you out of the program and kind of into a vacuum.
A nice problem to have.
It's a nice problem to have, but I think that from my perspective, if we're looking at that medium-term to long-term partnership with Africa, we also should start really thinking about articulating what happens at that point. And from my perspective, that's the point at which actually more interesting two-way reciprocal arrangements can come into being.
Akin to the one that you're, I think, in conversations with Kenya about now.
That's very much the spirit with which we are carrying out our Kenya conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you for the thoughtful precision in that response, Ambassador. So let's open this up. I think that we have some questions from reporters online and possibly some in the room and then others in the audience.
Sorry, if the reporters could please raise your hand if you have a question first. All right. And please say your name and affiliation before the question. Thank you.
Marilee, International Trade Today. Nice to see you. I want to ask about the global arrangement on steel. You said I'm hoping or I'm expecting to be able to share progress in the next weeks. Do you think it's possible that there'll have to be a partial solution at this point, and then a commitment to continue to work on the full ambition of both countering the non-market production and the green production and how that interplays with trade?
So let me take a step back on what we're trying to do with the U.S. and the U.S.-EU global arrangement. I talked about it in my remarks, but I also want to acknowledge how fundamentally paradigm shifting the vision is that we are pursuing, and actually how difficult a task it is that we have set out to accomplish with the Europeans. It really is a paradigm flip, right? From a race to the bottom to a race to the top, the U.S. and the EU coming together, putting our market forces together to drive through trade, cleaner production, cleaner trade in these carbon-intensive industries, but then also to defend against and non-market excess capacity, and then to drive incentives for fair trade and fair production. So it's a really big remit that we have. The second thing I'll just talk about is that it's really a very technically challenging thing that we are proposing to do. Although on that, I will say that there are probably as many, if not more, trade lawyers in Brussels as there are in Washington. So if there are two partners that could come together to solve a really difficult task, it should be the two of us. The third thing that I'll note is I think that what we are asking the EU to do on this, I feel confident that they are committed to doing it and they recognize the need to do it. But I think that on some level, it is also very, very difficult for Brussels on an emotional level, because what we are doing is quite different. And as I note all the time, change is really hard. And on this, I've also had the opportunity to reflect with my team on the record of US-EU trade negotiations and engagements. And I think that despite our best efforts, that our record has been, I would say sometimes we seem like star-crossed lovers. That it seems like, we should be able to get the thing across the line. And, maybe the most obvious recent point is on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, that despite the high-level political commitment, that was something that ultimately we weren't able to get across the line. So from my perspective, you never give up. Trade and economic collaboration is something you necessarily have to do with your partners. So this is a long way of saying, let's see. If hang with us for, I guess we've got exactly 3 weeks to get to our deadline. And I think that I will just say, as of right now, as hard a task as this has been, I'm extremely proud of our U.S. negotiators. And I will say that we remain extremely committed to our partners and working with them.
I have never heard a Romeo and Juliet metaphor used for trade before. I wonder if the U.S. reps are the Capulets or the Montagues in this one, but we're going to all start using that, Ambassador.
Right. Oh, one more question. Here.
Hi, thank you for your time, Ambassador. My name is Garrick Bender. I represent a small U.S. business currently who are using the tariff exclusions. I was wondering if you might be able to provide any insight on what happens to these exclusions come 2024. Thank you.
And you're talking about the China 301 tariffs in particular.
Correct. Thank you.
So we are in the midst of a review of the tariffs that is statutorily required, and have been engaging in this for the last year. We had a comment, public notice and comment period that closed earlier this year. And we're still in the process of a very robust interagency deliberation. Obviously, this is an area where the comments we solicited from the public are extremely important to us. And those are, I want to assure you, a very, very important and core part of the deliberations. And this is also an area where we hear very robustly from our partners in Congress who have been great champions for their constituents. So I am hopeful that we will be able to conclude the process by the end of the year. I think just, I guess about 10 days ago, been asked a lot of questions around what happens with a government shutdown. And the answer was, well, we go into triage mode and the pace of what we do may be impacted across the board. So we are working very, very hard for this next period of time. And again, take my estimates with a little bit of a grain of salt.
All right. I think we have time for one online question.
One online question, Mike?
Sure. There's a question from Robert Kuttner from the American Prospect about pressure coming from big tech companies in the US to define the European Union's pro-consumer regulations as trade discrimination. He asked, do you have a position on this? And might we expect some news about this anytime soon?
Ambassador, I suspect that you've heard this question before.
Occasionally this topic comes up. It's an important topic. Let me just start out by stating a couple facts. One is that the European Union has an incredible superpower as a political entity. And they're very good at regulating in this sense that they're able to get regulations going through very, very complex processes. I think that my partners in Brussels have some of the hardest jobs in terms of navigating between 27 member states. But their regulations often have extraterritorial reach that cause all of us to sit up and have to respond. On their regulations in the digital arena, I recognize, and this is through a lot of engagement with our partners in Brussels, that they are very, very concerned about the rights of European citizens with respect to privacy, for instance. The opportunity and the economic vibrancy in this arena of the economy to allow for opportunities for new entrants and for new entrants to grow, startups to grow into small and then medium-sized and to compete with the very largest. I also recognize that in terms of this industry, the largest players, and they're really large, are almost all American companies. And so I think that, that's where the tension comes up, which is in the trade policy conversation, our guiding disciplines are around discrimination. Are you treating foreign companies the same way you are treating your own? Are you treating this foreign company the same way that you are treating that foreign company, right? It's that's the traditional trade conversation. I think that as it then crosses over into regulatory efforts that impact these big technology companies, we have to really be cognizant that measures that may look like they have a discriminatory effect may or may not be advanced with a discriminatory intent. And so I think that from a trade perspective, that is the additional nuance that we have to bring to our engagement with our partners around their intentions, and then also around the impacts. And last thing I'll say on this as well is in this area, and I'll bring it back to climate as well, in these two areas, digital and also climate, what we are able to do in trade negotiations and trade policy is limited by where the American policy consensus is represented. And I want to really put a fine point, and this is truly out of deference and respect, on the US Congress, that in areas where the US Congress continues to debate and has not settled regulatory questions in digital and also on climate, that there is going to be a limit to what we can do in trade in the international sphere. So I know that my partners in Congress love having us lead in all things, especially in trade. And I would just say that in some areas that we cannot lead until Congress speaks and acts. And I would just say on digital and on climate, those are two incredibly important areas where we cannot afford to sit on the sidelines, where I will be very, very eager to work with our Congress.
We certainly can't have a passive Congress on these issues, but Ambassador, if you don't mind, I don't want to end on that regulatory note and that note about Congress. In addition to your brilliant technical mastery, you also have the ability to motivate with a sense of what's possible. I'll note that in the upcoming COP 28, we have the first ever trade day at a COP. Can you help us to understand, as we close out this conversation, what it really means to bring trade leaders like yourself into ministerial conversation with those who are leading on climate?
So I think that
That is a space of agency.
yes, this is a really interesting development, which is the highlighting of trade at COP. I will tell you that at the last ministerial conference of the WTO, which was in Geneva last June, that there was a lot of energy on environment, sustainability, and climate at the WTO. And I think that that has only grown since last June, and I think that it will continue to grow. I think that we all know that climate solutions, in order to be effective, have to be things that we are all participating in, and that the trade piece of this is central. So I think that, it's interesting to have from COP building out like a bridge towards the trade solution from COP. And I would say that just know that from the trade conversation, there's a building out on climate. I do expect that in these next weeks and months and years, and hope that these two conversations converge. So I'm looking forward to helping to facilitate that happening.
We know you will. Ambassador, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for your commitment, and thank you for your broad service, over 200,000 miles. Thank you.
Thank you.